This time on combat ships. In naval warfare, when you're sunk, you're sunk.
If a vessel goes down, it means there's a U-boat nearby. You're on your own, Jack.
Stories of vessels that were doomed from the start.
We all knew that if she got caught in action, she was going to get sunk.
The ship simply filled with water and sank like a stone. It was probably gone within 10 minutes.
And cornered men fighting to survive.
They discussed it as a crew. They would be blown up.
What happens when disaster strikes? Combat ships. Fast. Effective.
The mission is pure James Bond espionage.
Deadly.
Japan is willing to throw the dice to engage just about every aspect of their military force in a climactic, decisive battle to stop the United States.
They have changed the world.
Warships have been key factors in global history, from the beginning of civilization to the present day.
Thanks to clever design, raw firepower, and the heroism of their crews. In the summer of 1956, a Swedish amateur archaeologist named Anders Franzén took a boat and a movie camera out into Stockholm Harbor. He had a homemade device to collect samples from the bottom. Franzén had a hunch something priceless was below him. A 17th century combat ship. A single piece of wood proved him right. 5 years later, a massive recovery operation began, and on the 24th of April, 1961, old timbers emerged from the water. Built to be the largest and most impressive combat ship of the age, from the moment she set sail, she was doomed. This is the Vasa. Named after the royal family, the Vasa was built in 1626, a time when Sweden was becoming a military force. The Swedish king, Gustav Adolf, had ambitious plans for his nation.
He saw himself as a great Renaissance prince. And in order to do that, he had to take Sweden from the periphery into the center in some way. And he did that largely through warfare.
Gustav wanted to create a new type of navy. Instead of using ships simply to carry soldiers, he wanted them to be heavily armed gun platforms. In the winter of 1626, the Vasa took shape in the royal dockyard in Stockholm.
It's going to be the wonder of the age. It will show the power of the King of Sweden.
King Gustav had already reformed his army, making sure his soldiers all had the same type of musket. He wanted every ship in his navy to have the same type of powerful bronze cannon.
The armament for the ship had to be specifically made for it because it was an experiment to follow the king's idea of standardization. And so an entirely new armament was ordered from the Royal Gun Foundry here in Stockholm.
The Vasa's 64 guns could fire over 500 pounds of shot in a single broadside, traveling almost at the speed of sound. That many 24-pounder guns needed an extra deck, so the shipwrights made the ship taller. That created a problem.
It's going to be higher out of the water, more windage, more weight high up, but nothing extra below the waterline, no extra ballast, no extra stability. This ship is going to be dangerously top-heavy. Anybody who knew anything about ships would have known that this was not a good idea. But the king is absolute, and the king's will prevails.
It would not meet modern stability requirements, it would not even meet normal 17th century stability requirements. And that's why the ship was unsafe.
On the Sunday afternoon of the 10th of August, 1628, Vasa was finally ready to set sail. The king was away at war in Prussia, but thousands of his subjects turned out to watch. Among them were foreign spies intrigued by Sweden's new warship. On board the Vasa were around 200 people, including women and children. The Vasa's skipper was keen to show off his new ship.
If you're going to sail with the most powerfully armed warship in the world in front of all the spies of Northern Europe, it's not the most powerfully armed warship in the world if the gun ports are closed. You could have an empty ship. You have to show off those guns. You have to fire a salute as you leave town.
The Vasa sailed about 1,000 yards, and then the breeze picked up.
And when the first gust of wind filled the sails, the ship began to heel to the port side, this side behind me, and it hung there for a minute. It didn't really come back up the way a ship should. Knowledgeable people on board must have realized already that there was something wrong. Everybody else and guests probably just held their breath for a minute or laughed it off.
But things escalated quickly.
The wind filled the sails again, and the ship heeled even more over to port. In fact, it heeled so far to port that the lower row of gun ports went into the water.
The sea began to pour in on one side of the deck, pushing the port side down even further. So even more water ran in, cascading down into the hull. From that moment, the Vasa was lost.
The ship simply filled with water and sank like a stone. It was probably gone within 10 minutes.
This is the shortest maiden voyage in the history of shipbuilding.
One spy working for the English reported back.
The King of Sweden had a ship built, and going in one calm day from Stockholm, within sight of the town, she fell over and sank in 18 fathoms. There drowned in her 40. The rest was saved by boats.
The recovery operation in the 1960s revealed the scale of the terror inside Vasa as she sank.
Probably all the people who were below decks, once it became clear that water was pouring in, did everything they could to get out of the ship. Almost all the skeletons found inside the ship are found near ladders. We have one man who was trapped underneath a cannon. His skeleton was found with his legs trapped underneath the gun carriage. We have one man that we believe fell down a series of hatches and ended up in the hold, in a hatch with no ladder in it. And so there was no way for him to get back out. And then that's where he was trapped and died.
An inquest began within days of the sinking. The king demanded answers. Unsurprisingly, the evidence showed Vasa was top-heavy. Fingers pointed at the shipwright who had died the year before.
He was the perfect scapegoat because he was dead. He couldn't defend himself and he didn't need to be punished. There's a brilliant political solution there that makes everybody happy.
For over 300 years, the mighty combat ship lay at the bottom of Stockholm Harbor, until 1961, when Anders Franzén and his team brought her to the surface. He had great plans for the Vasa.
The brilliance of Franzén was he was a great salesman, and he had a vision of what Vasa could become. He saw that Vasa could become the centerpiece of a world-class museum.
The ship is now one of Sweden's most popular tourist attractions, a 400-year-old cautionary tale.
And even today in Sweden, Vasa is a kind of slang term for failure.
So we have the world's most unsuccessful 17th century warship on display as an example of what not to do in future. And all students of naval architecture should go and see the Vasa to see just how brilliant it looks and how catastrophically dangerous it actually was.
300 years after the Vasa, naval technology had changed dramatically. But one design flaw could still spell disaster and death. This is USS Nautilus. Her launch in January 1954 was a global event. Although powered by a nuclear reactor, the Nautilus worked on a Victorian principle. The reactor produced steam to turn the turbine that moved the sub. It wasn't the first submarine to use steam. 40 years earlier, the British Royal Navy built a steam-powered sub of its own. If Nautilus was the epitome of success, this earlier vessel, the epitome of failure. In the early years of the 20th century, navies were fixated on submarine technology.
The Admiralty wanted a submarine that was fast enough to keep up with the rest of the fleet. So this required speed, well over 20 knots.
Only steam could provide that kind of power. In 1913, British designers came up with a sub equipped with oil-fired boilers that powered steam turbines. They were known as K-boats.
The K-boats are a unique design. They're absolutely vast. They have a full-size steam power plant that allows them on the surface to drive them along at the same sort of speeds as light cruisers.
The K-boat's size had a drawback. Before it dived, over 20 hatches and vents had to be closed. As one submariner complained, it had too many damn holes. But with World War I now at its height, there was no time to wait for a redesign. The British commissioned a Scottish firm, Fairfield, to start building the K-class subs. The first, named K-13, quickly took shape. On Monday, the 29th of January 1917, it sailed from Fairfield shipyard to nearby Gairloch for tests. In charge of the sub was Lieutenant Commander Godfrey Herbert. Men like Herbert were used to danger and risk.
Submariners, particularly in the early days, were brave, they were pioneers. They saw themselves as a race apart, the trade as they called themselves, and so they were very special people.
At about 11 a.m., the tests began. K-13 dove for the first time. Within minutes, there was a problem.
They find a leak in the engine room, but unfortunately, because of the heat from the steam turbines and the boilers, they can't find where the leak is.
K-13 surfaced, and the engine room cooled down. Commander Herbert decided to dive once more to find the leak. Percy Hillhouse, one of Fairfield's naval architects, was on board.
The hatches were all closed, and the illuminated signal, engine room closed, signified that hatches, funnels, and ventilators had been closed down.
As the submarine starts to dive, there is a shout from within the engine room spaces itself that the boiler room is flooding freely.
K-13's engine room was quickly filling with seawater, dragging the rest of the sub down with it.
For me, as a former submariner, it must have been terrifying. The one thing that submariners fear above everything else is flooding.
When Herbert realizes what's happening, he raises the command to close the watertight doors, which will have the effect of closing off the last half of the vessel, leaving it open to the sea, and unfortunately condemning the men there to death.
Herbert stopped the flooding, but the sub was still sinking. K-13 came to rest 50 feet down in the waters of the loch. Above them, on a steamer carrying observers for the tests, no one was aware that anything had gone wrong. Commander Herbert took a roll call. 31 men were already dead. Percy Hillhouse wrote,
Our position appeared to be desperate, and I do not think there were any on board who had more than the very faintest hope of ever seeing blue sky again.
Although the crew didn't realize it, 4 vital vents had been left open when they dove. It took an hour before observers on the steamer began to worry. They assembled a rescue team. On K-13, the oxygen starts to run out.
They become drowsy, some men lie down, some men start to move very slowly indeed, and there's a consideration that after a few hours that oxygen will be gone completely.
As the hours passed, conditions in K-13 became desperate. The lights kept fusing, and the equipment gave off electric shocks.
The survivors on K-13 tried to conserve their oxygen by not doing anything. The more you exert yourself, the more exercise you do, the more oxygen you use and the more carbon dioxide you breathe out. And carbon dioxide is almost as bad as lack of oxygen. In high quantities, it affects your reasoning, you become lethargic, and you get to the point where you can't even help yourself to save your own life.
One submariner tapped out a desperate message in Morse code on the hull. "Give us some air. Give us some air." Lieutenant Commander Herbert and another sub-captain named Francis Goodhart had had enough.
So they decided that Goodhart, who was a supernumerary, he was going to be a captain of another K-class submarine, and who was along for the experience, would attempt to escape through the conning tower.
Herbert and Goodhart climbed into the tower. The plan was to flood it. Goodhart would open the lower hatch. Herbert would stay behind, close the hatch so the conning tower could be drained of water. Goodhart would open a second hatch and escape. Herbert would then climb back into the sub.
However, it goes wrong. Herbert, who has no intention of leaving the submarine and no intention of escaping, actually is blasted out of the submarine at the same time as Goodhart is. Goodhart is either knocked unconscious or trapped within the submarine's bridge superstructure, whilst Herbert is blasted clear and comes to the surface.
Francis Goodhart drowned. An exhausted Herbert told the rescuers that his men were running out of air. Finally, the salvage team managed to attach a tube from another submarine to K-13 and blow compressed air into her forward ballast tanks. Slowly, K-13's bow rose above the water.
And then it was possible to get a cutting torch and cut a hole in the outer casing and then through to the pressure hull and let the men escape after 55 hours of being entombed in this submarine.
Percy Hillhouse wrote,
"We began to appear one by one out of the depths and onto the deck of K-13. 48 men came out, each one greeted by a tremendous ovation.
But 32 men died in the accident. They were buried on a hill above the shores of Gerlach. Lieutenant Commander Herbert never dived in a sub again.
He does not go to sea in another K-class submarine. He commands other ships, but he does not go back to sea in a submarine. K-13 is salvaged, and she's put back into service. However, the Navy rename her K-22, and she goes off and fights the war with the other K-class submarines.
So they persist really in the face of all the evidence with the development of the K-boats. And when they enter service, they became rapidly nicknamed the Calamity class, K for Calamity, because so many of them are lost in accidents.
The K-boats had a catastrophic war.
Not a single K-boat is lost in action with the enemy, but 6 of them are lost in accidents. They are a complete disaster as a class of submarine.
One of the consequences of K-13 sinking in the Gerlach is that the submarine service would never have another submarine named 13.
As the crew of K-13 were being rescued, a few miles away a new vessel was under construction. It would become one of the most famous combat ships in the world. Not for a victory, but a humiliating defeat. It's 1916, the height of the First World War. And in the John Brown shipyard on Clydebank, Scotland, a vast combat ship was taking shape. A state-of-the-art Royal Navy battlecruiser named HMS Hood. designed to take on anything any enemy fleet could throw at it.
Hood was built on number 3 berth of the East Yard here at Clydebank, and she was launched just over there where that piece of slipway is still visible.
The Hood was afloat. Now she needed her guns.
Just one of Hood's 15-inch guns weighed 100 tons. So this crane here was rated at 150 tons. She could lift up to that.
In all, the Hood was equipped with 8 15-inch guns, 12 5.5-inch guns, and 6 torpedo tubes. To make her lighter and faster, she was built with less armor than most warships. What she lost in protection, she would gain in speed. But a battle on the 31st of May, 1916, changed naval design forever. The Battle of Jutland was the biggest naval clash of the war. The British and German fleets met off the coast of Denmark. The Royal Navy was victorious, but at a cost.
During the Battle of Jutland, the British suffered very heavy losses. They lost 3 battle cruisers. They lost far more people than the Germans, and they tended to blame lack of armor protection for this. The main lesson officially drawn from the battle was that you needed more armor.
The Hood was instantly out of date. In 1920, she returned to the shipyard for a refit. The archives of the University of Glasgow have the original blueprints showing the changes made after Jutland.
What this drawing shows is that the belt armor on the side of Hood has been increased to 5, 7, and 12 inches, a considerable increase from when the ship was first designed. And altogether, these additions to the armoring of Hood amounted to about 5,000 tons. The drawing is showing the increase in thickness of plates. For example, 35 pounds up to 40, here again and again.
With her sides now thickly armored, the Hood was once again the pride of the Royal Navy.
She was heavily armed, she was fast, and she seemed to symbolize the whole power of the British Empire. Britain was back as a major power.
Bill Cass served on the Hood between 1938 and 1940.
Well, it was vast. You never really got to know it. First thing that impressed me was what they called the measured mile. It was a long passageway in the ship. It went for ages right through the bows of the ship, like, and everything was on such a massive scale.
The Hood would soon be put to the test. As the Second World War broke out, the German Navy targeted convoys bringing vital supplies from the United States to Britain. By 1941, the Germans had 2 awe-inspiring combat ships at their disposal, the Tirpitz and her sister ship, Bismarck.
Bismarck was regarded by the British as a formidable threat. She could seriously interrupt transatlantic communications at a time when Lend-Lease was just taking hold and American supplies were crucially important. So her appearance in the Atlantic was something that had to be dealt with as quickly as possible.
On May 22, 1941, Bismarck left her base in Norway. The Hood, together with a brand new battleship, Prince of Wales, were sent to the Denmark Strait near Greenland to intercept Bismarck. Admiral Lancelot Holland, on board the Hood, was in charge of the British flotilla. At dawn on the 24th of May, his lookouts spotted the Bismarck and the cruiser Prince Eugen. For the first time, the mighty Hood would be tested in combat. A German sailor on board the Prince Eugen filmed the battle. The Hood opened fire on what it thought was the Bismarck, but it was the wrong ship.
The Germans quite deliberately made their ships look similar. And at a distance, Prince Eugen, that was actually a very big cruiser, could be easily mistaken for Bismarck. And this allowed Bismarck relatively unhindered fire in the vital opening part of the action.
Bismarck had plenty of time to find its range.
The first two salvos from Bismarck don't go close to Hood. An 8-inch shell from Prince Eugen hits Hood in the after part of the shelter deck, and casualties are sustained.
The blow reminded the crew of what they already knew. Their ship had a fatal flaw. Although her sides had been reinforced, the Hood's deck armor had not. She was a disaster waiting to happen.
Every stoker that was on the Hood knew that she was a hazard, that if she got in the wrong place at the wrong time, she's going to get sunk. She was the best ship in the Navy at the time, but her armor was bad.
First blood to the Germans. Admiral Holland also knew the weakness of his deck armor. He tried to get as close to the Bismarck as possible.
Vertical armour, say on the side of a battleship, is important, particularly at close ranges where the trajectory of incoming shells is quite flat. You're going to take the damage where you want it on your armoured side. But at long distances, plunging shells are likely to go through decks as much as they're likely to hit the side of the ship.
Admiral Holland's maneuver was too little, too late. A deadly salvo from Bismarck found its target. The Hood's final moments are captured on film. A shell penetrated the thin deck armor and landed in a gun magazine.
This explodes, this causes the after 15-inch magazine to explode, and a wall of fire goes through the ship. Effectively, Hood is blown to pieces. Her bow is last seen going down stern first.
"1,415 officers and men were killed." Bill Cass was on leave when he heard the news.
And I thought of all the shipmates that I'd known and I wouldn't be seeing again. I thought what a terrible end it must have been to get carried down the deck in a steel coffin.
The loss of those 1,415 officers and men still is the largest loss of life in any one event in the Royal Navy. To put it in context, the equivalent of 3 battalions of troops being killed in one event.
Only 3 men survived. The Bismarck and Prince Eugen steamed on victorious into the Atlantic.
The sinking of the Hood was a tremendous shock. This symbol of British naval power, British imperial power, had been sunk in its first two-way action. The Germans saw this, quite rightly in fact, as their greatest naval victory so far in the war.
But the Royal Navy soon got its revenge. They sank the Bismarck just 3 days later. It isn't always faulty design that dooms combat ships. Sometimes it's the unpredictable ocean. In the 13th century, a natural disaster stopped an invasion and inspired one of the most infamous strategies of the Second World War. Under the waters of this bay in western Japan are the remains of a combat fleet. Until D-Day, it was the largest armada in history. In the 13th century, the ruthless Mongol warlord, Genghis Khan, created one of the largest empires the world has ever seen.
The Mongol dynasty at that time stretched from East Asia to Europe. It ruled about 30% of the world's territories.
But Japan stood defiant. His grandson, Kublai Khan, wanted to change that. In 1281, he assembled a mighty fleet and sailed for Japan. The 13th century explorer Marco Polo wrote,
Kublai, the Grand Khan, having heard much of the immense wealth that was in this island, formed a plan to get possession of it. For this purpose, he sent 2 of his barons with a great navy and a great force of horse and foot.
Most of the fleet anchored here, Imari Bay, off Kyushu. Thousands of Kublai Khan's troops made their way ashore. Japanese samurai defenders fought back hard.
The Japanese actually knew that the Chinese were coming, so they were probably prepared to fight against this larger fleet that was coming from China.
But the Japanese were outnumbered. Defeat seemed inevitable. Then their emperor prayed for divine intervention. According to legend, a miracle happened. The weather suddenly changed.
The winds were probably much higher than usual, maybe tens of meters per second. So strong, in fact, that people wouldn't have been able to stand. In Imari Bay, where the waves would usually be calm, many of Khan's ships sank.
Some vessels tried to escape into deep water, some tried to set anchor to brace against the wind. So it was probably just a panic everywhere.
It's believed over 100,000 men drowned. Kublai Khan's remaining forces were soon overwhelmed. He called off the attack. Japan was saved, and the story became legend. In the 1980s, Japanese archaeologists dived off Kyushu to see if any evidence of Kublai Khan's combat fleet survived.
Here in the sea near Takashima, on the seabed, many items were discovered from the time of the Mongol invasion. Arms, weapons, as well as everyday things such as bowls, jars, and ornaments and helmets. Around 4,000 relics were found.
Randy Sasaki was one of the archaeologists who painstakingly analyzed the hundreds of ships' timbers brought to the surface.
I think my work was some of a jigsaw puzzle, but jigsaw puzzle with 4,000 different puzzle boxes put into a blender and then bring it up and trying to piece those 4,000 different puzzles into one picture, which is the total story of the Mongol invasion.
The timbers give a sense of the size of Khan's combat ships.
A typical Chinese vessel at the time, or basically a junk vessel, we call it, had a keel and then a V-shaped hull, and a 3-masted vessel is what we know is a most typical vessel of the time.
One of the most intriguing discoveries found among the shipwrecks were these strange objects. CT scans showed that they were the world's first grenades, known as tetsuhao.
The way tetsuhao it worked is basically easy to explain using this 3D printed model. So it's a round ball. This is only a half shape. After they created the ball, they put in these metal pieces inside with gunpowder and sulfur. So there was a fuse that actually came out from here. So they lit the fire and then throw it with a catapult and probably exploded in front of the enemy basically spewing out all these metal pieces. It was more of a weapon to create a fear and chaos among the people, not actually to kill a person.
The Tetsuhao were used both on land and at sea. They are the world's first exploding naval armaments.
Tetsuhao, if it were used from a ship, it will probably be shipped towards the shore because it wasn't very accurate, and the range would be probably 30 to 40 meters.
The grenades reveal another motive for Kublai Khan's invasion of Japan: explosives.
At that time, explosive devices were the latest weapons. So there is another theory, because he wanted sulfur, which is the raw material for gunpowder.
The storm that sank Khan's fleet and saved Japan in 1281 was given a name: Divine Wind, or in Japanese, kamikaze.
It's no accident that as the war turns against them in the 1940s, the kamikaze is dreamt up. That's not a name for an aeroplane, that's the wind that destroyed Kublai Khan's fleet. It's a divine wind sent by the gods, and it will punish the infidel for their temerity in attempting to invade the Japanese islands. So putting some crazy kids on speed pills in obsolete aeroplanes and crashing them into American fleets seems perfectly logical.
On the other side of the world, another combat fleet was destroyed not by a divine wind, but catastrophic human error. The 4th of July, 1942. A large American and British convoy, codenamed PQ17, is heading for Stalin's Russia when it comes under attack from the German Luftwaffe. "35 ships carrying $750 million worth of tanks, food, and guns are under fire.
The Russians are carrying the bulk of the war. They've got 300 divisions fighting the Germans on the Eastern Front. To keep them in the war, to keep them supplied, to kill as many Germans as possible, we needed to get as many supplies as we could to the Russians.
PQ-17 fights off the Luftwaffe and sails on. They're on a dangerous journey to the northern Russian port of Archangel. For the British Admiralty, the biggest fear was not the Luftwaffe or even U-boats. It was a single battleship, the mighty Tirpitz, sister ship of the Bismarck.
The Tirpitz was feared because it was very heavily armoured, so it was hard to sink, and it was very fast for its size, but above all because it carried a tremendous punch, 8 15-inch guns.
The man in charge of the Royal Navy was Admiral Sir Dudley Pound. He was obsessed with the threat Tirpitz posed.
Dudley Pound is one of the most controversial First Sea Lords ever. He was very prone to overwork. He insisted on taking a lot of decisions himself. He didn't like being given advice.
Naval intelligence told Pound that the Tirpitz was safely in port. Pound didn't believe them. He was convinced that the battleship was about to attack PQ-17.
For the first time in the war, the Americans had contributed significant naval forces to the British Home Fleet that was providing the distant cover for the convoy. And Dudley Pound may have felt that this first Anglo-American naval operation could not be risked in the face of an attack with the Tirpitz.
Pound gave a fateful order.
Dudley Pound makes a bad decision. He decides to scatter the convoy and withdraw the covering forces back into the Norwegian Sea.
That was a death sentence, because it opened each ship up individually to being picked off one at a time, not by the big ships, which actually turned around and went back, but by German aircraft and German submarines.
Hollywood actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr. was an officer on board the cruiser USS Wichita. He wrote in his diary,
"We hate leaving PQ-17 behind. It looks so helpless now since the scatter order came through. The ships are going round in circles like so many frightened chicks.
When they scattered, the convoy was still 600 miles from the Russian port of Archangel. The scene was set for one of the greatest maritime disasters of the Second World War. The Germans couldn't believe their luck. They pounced on the unprotected merchant ships. Within a day, U-boats and the Luftwaffe had sent 12 of them to the bottom. But not all the Navy escorts fled the scene. One British officer disobeyed orders. His name was Lieutenant Leo Gradwell, an amateur sailor and lawyer before the war. His only sailing qualification was a pleasure yacht certificate of competency. Gradwell was in command of a most unlikely combat ship, one of the smallest in the convoy, crewed by Royal Navy sailors and former fishermen, a converted trawler named the Ayrshire.
It was a fishing vessel with a large bow so that we could take the very, very large waves.
They had depth charges and they had one gun. Wasn't going to do a lot, was it?
Lieutenant Gradwell was still determined to guide as many ships as possible to Archangel. He rounded up 3 U.S. merchant vessels, Troubadour, Silver Sword, and Ironclad, and sailed north.
The thing about my father was that he could think for himself. And he always said to us, you must learn to think for yourselves. You don't take what other people say. Think about what is right. And that was the core of him.
Gradwell knew they were vulnerable to attack, possibly from the Tirpitz, but he had a plan. He told his small convoy to follow him into an ice floe.
They had no maps. Dad's map was a handy atlas, a road atlas.
The corvette signalled to them, so where are you going? He replied, to hell. And the first one to come back, I hope.
At 6:30 p.m. on the 5th of July, when they were completely surrounded by ice, Gradwell ordered all 4 ships to stop. Then he carried out the next part of his plan.
They decided they needed to have camouflage, so he asked any of the other ships if they got any paint, and I think it was Silver Sword that had loads of white paint. So everybody was told to come out and paint their ship, and then cover all the guns and everything else on deck that looked dark with tablecloths and sheets, because they hadn't got enough white paint for everything.
They painted and camouflaged the ships for over 6 hours, but Gradwell wasn't finished. The merchant ships had a deadly cargo on deck that could be useful, brand new tanks.
They turned the turrets around, loaded them. The other thing they did was to put all the depth charges primed in the bow of the ship, so that if the Tirpitz came anywhere near them, which was their main worry, they were going to ram the Tirpitz.
They discussed it as a crew that they would be blown up, but they would have killed the enemy. It's madness, really, but...
As Gradwell prepared to fight, to the south, the remnants of PQ17 were under attack. On that day, July 5th, 8 more merchant ships were lost, and 60 men killed. Dozens were adrift in lifeboats.
The North Atlantic is not a happy place to be driving a ship anyway. And if your ship went down, even in a convoy, other vessels didn't stop to pick you up. Because if you stopped to pick up survivors of one sunken vessel, that made you a stationary target. If a vessel goes down, it means there's a U-boat nearby. You're on your own, Jack.
After 24 hours in the ice, Gradwell's convoy edged its way out towards Russia. On July 9th, they reached the Russian archipelago of Novaya Zemlya and inched their way round the coast, hiding in fjords to avoid detection. Then, 21 days after the order to scatter, the 4 ships arrived safely in Archangel. They brought with them 20,000 tons of vital war supplies. 35 merchant ships left Iceland in PQ17. Only 11 made it to Archangel. 120,000 tons of supplies were lost. 153 men died. Admiral Pound continued as Sea Lord, but his health was failing. A little over a year later, he was dead. Safely in port, Leo Gradwell wrote to his mother.
I can't tell you anything, of course, except that I have had my one big opportunity in this war, and that everyone is being very nice about it.
Single-handedly, he and his ship's company effectively save a quarter of the ships that make it through to Russia. It's that simple. He saves a lot of ships, a lot of equipment, and a lot of lives.
He was a special person. Yes, he was a very special person.
He had a huge sense of duty and integrity, I think, and this is what you did to help your country.
The history of doomed vessels has shown that despite the courage and determination of their crews, they are always at risk from the elements, the enemy, and human error.